The sun was setting over Phoenix when Angela Brasso clipped on her helmet for what should have been a simple bike ride along the canal on the 8th of November, 1992. At 22, she was preparing for her birthday in just days, her whole future stretching ahead like the desert horizon. But that evening ride became her last breath of freedom. When her bicycle was found abandoned by the water's edge and her brutalized body discovered days later, it shattered everything this growing city believed about safety after dark. Then 17-year-old Melanie Burness vanished the same way, found floating in the same canal waters. For 30 years, families waited, investigators hunted shadows, and a killer walked free among them. But when DNA finally whispered his name in 2015, the arrest of Brian Patrick Miller, the eccentric zombie hunter, revealed a truth more chilling than fiction. Evil had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The November evening air carried the scent of desert sage and cooling asphalt as Angela Brasso adjusted her helmet straps one final time. At 22, she had developed a routine that brought structure to her day's work at the office, evening classes, and these peaceful bike rides along the canal that cut through Phoenix like a ribbon of possibility. Her mother had called earlier, reminding her about dinner plans for her upcoming birthday, just 4 days away. Angela pedaled past joggers, finishing their evening runs, their breath visible in small puffs against the dusky sky. She waved to an elderly man fishing near the bridge, the same spot where he appeared every evening like clockwork. The canal path stretched ahead, familiar and welcoming, bordered by desert brush that rustled in the gentle wind. She had no way of knowing that someone was watching. The path grew quieter as she rode further from the residential areas. Street lights flickered on automatically, casting long shadows across the pavement. Angela felt strong, confident, alive. She was planning her future, considering graduate school, thinking about the career she wanted to build. Her whole life stretched before her like the desert night sky, infinite with stars and possibility. But as darkness settled over the canal, the familiar path transformed into something else entirely. The gentle evening breeze carried no warning, no sign of the horror about to unfold. Angela's bike tire rolled steadily against the asphalt, the sound rhythmic and hypnotic, masking the footsteps that began to follow her into the shadows. When she failed to return home that night, her bright blue helmet would be found crushed and abandoned, a silent witness to the moment when a routine bike ride became a nightmare that would haunt Phoenix for 30 years. Angela's mother paced the kitchen floor as midnight approached, her eyes darting to the telephone every few seconds. This wasn't like her daughter. Angela always called if she was going to be late, always checked in, always kept her promises. The dinner they had planned for 8 o'clock grew cold on the counter. The candles she had lit now burned down to waxy stubs. By 1 in the morning, panic crept in like a living thing, clawing at her chest. She began calling hospitals, her voice steady but desperate as she described her daughter to tired night shift nurses. 22 years old, brown hair, about 5'6". She was wearing a red jacket and went for a bike ride near the canal. The responses were always the same, polite, professional, negative. As dawn broke over Phoenix, Angela's mother stood at her kitchen window, watching the empty driveway where her daughter's car sat untouched. She had called Angela's friends, her coworkers, even distant relatives, hoping against hope that somehow her daughter had ended up somewhere safe, somewhere explainable. At 7 in the morning, she called the police. "My daughter is missing," she said, her voice cracking on the words she never thought she would have to speak. She went for a bike ride yesterday evening and never came home. Within hours, volunteers gathered at the canal. Angela's photograph was photocopied dozens of times, her bright smile multiplied and distributed throughout the city. The missing person flyers appeared on telephone poles, store windows, and community bulletin boards, each one a desperate plea for information, for hope, for the safe return of a daughter who had simply vanished into the desert night. But as search parties formed and helicopters circled overhead, Angela's mother knew in her heart that something terrible had happened to her child. Detective Ramirez arrived at the canal as the sun climbed higher over Phoenix, casting harsh shadows across the crime scene. Angela's bicycle lay on its side near the water's edge, its wheels still slowly spinning in the morning breeze. The sight sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the desert air. 23 years on the force had prepared him for many things, but something about this scene felt different, wrong. The bicycle appeared to have been carefully placed rather than simply dropped or thrown aside. There were no obvious signs of struggle on the path itself, no torn clothing or scattered personal items that might indicate what had happened to Angela Brasso. The search teams worked methodically, combing every inch of the canal and surrounding brush. Detective Ramirez coordinated with divers who prepared to search the murky water, though everyone hoped they wouldn't find what they feared was there. On the third day, the terrible discovery was made. Angela's body surfaced near a culvert 2 miles downstream from where her bicycle had been found. The condition of the remains shocked even veteran investigators. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered with a brutality that spoke of rage, of someone who took pleasure. in inflicting suffering. Days later, her severed head was discovered floating in the same dark water. The crime scene photographs would become part of a file that would grow thick with evidence, witness statements, and false leads over the coming decades. But in that moment, as Detective Ramirez stared at the image of the abandoned bicycle, he made a silent promise to Angela and her family. This case would not go cold. This killer would not get away with what he had done. No matter how long it took, justice would be served. The photograph captured more than just an abandoned bicycle. It captured the moment when Phoenix lost its innocence. The headlines screamed from every newsstand in Phoenix. Television reporters lined up along the canal path, their serious faces illuminated by camera lights as they delivered updates to a city gripped by fear. Angela Brasso's murder had struck at the heart of what people believed about their community, that young women could ride bikes alone, that evil things didn't happen to innocent people in broad daylight. Parents throughout the city gathered their children closer. The canal path, once a popular destination for joggers and cyclists, became deserted as darkness fell. Women who had never given a second thought to their evening routines now locked their doors and checked their windows twice before bed. Local news stations ran safety segments, interviewing security experts about personal protection and self-defense. Hardware stores reported increased sales of pepper spray, door locks, and security systems. The sense of violation extended far beyond Angela's immediate family. An entire community had been traumatized by the randomness and brutality of her death. Detective Ramirez fielded dozens of calls from concerned citizens reporting suspicious activity. Every strange car, every unfamiliar face, every shadow that seemed out of place became potential evidence in a case that consumed the city's attention. The tip line rang, constantly with reports that ranged from genuinely helpful to paranoid ramblings of people whose fear had gotten the better of their judgment. But as weeks passed and no arrest was made, frustration began to replace fear. Community meetings filled with angry residents demanding answers from police officials who had none to give. The newspaper headlines shifted from breaking news to ongoing investigation, then to growing concern about public safety. Angela's mother attended every community meeting, every press conference, carrying her daughter's photograph and refusing to let the city forget. Her presence served as a constant reminder that behind the headlines and statistics was a real person, a real family, a real loss that could not be measured in column inches or television ratings. 17-year-old Melanie Bernis wrote in her diary every night before bed, recording the typical concerns of a teenager navigating her final year of high school. Her entries spoke of college applications, weekend plans with friends, and the boy in her chemistry class who made her stomach flutter when he smiled. The 21st of September, 1993, should have been just another ordinary day recorded in her neat handwriting. Instead, it became the day she vanished. Melanie had told her parents she was riding her bike to meet friends at the shopping center near their home. It was a trip she had made dozens of times before, a short ride through familiar neighborhoods that had always felt safe. Her mother had called goodbye from the kitchen window as Melanie pedaled down the driveway, her long hair streaming behind her in the afternoon breeze. When she failed to meet her friends and didn't return home by dinner time, her parents felt the first stirrings of concern. By 10 o'clock, concern had transformed into panic. By midnight, they were making frantic phone calls to police, to hospitals, to anyone who might have seen their daughter. The similarity to Angela Brasso's disappearance, 11 months earlier, was not lost on Detective Ramirez when he received the call. Another young woman, another bicycle ride, another family torn apart by inexplicable absence. As he drove through the dark streets of Phoenix toward the Bernis home, a sick certainty settled in his stomach. This was no coincidence. Melanie's diary sat open on her bedroom desk, her pen lying beside it where she had left it the night before. Her last entry spoke of excitement about homecoming dress shopping and worry about an upcoming math test. Normal teenage concerns that now seemed achingly innocent. The diary would remain untouched for months, her parents unable to close the book on their daughter's life, unable to accept that her story had ended so abruptly and violently. The phone call came at dawn, just as Detective Ramirez was starting his second cup of coffee. Another body in the canal. Another family about to have their worst fears confirmed. He drove through the empty Phoenix streets with a heavy heart, already knowing what he would find. Melanie Bernis floated face down in the dark water, her body discovered by an early morning jogger who would require months of therapy to recover from what he had witnessed. Like Angela before her, Melanie had been sexually assaulted and murdered with shocking brutality. The similarities between the two crimes were undeniable: the location, the methods, the age of the victims, the devastating violence inflicted upon them. Detective Ramirez stood at the water's edge as the medical examiner's team carefully removed Melanie's body from the canal. The crime scene photographers documented every detail, their camera flashes reflecting off the dark water like lightning in a storm. This was no longer an isolated incident. Phoenix had a serial killer. The task force was formed within hours of the discovery. Detectives from across the department were reassigned to focus exclusively on the canal murders. FBI profilers were brought in to analyze the PPE, crime scenes, and develop a psychological profile of the killer. Community leaders demanded action, answers, arrests. But the killer had left frustratingly little physical evidence. No witnesses had come forward with useful information. The victims had been chosen seemingly at random, with no connection between them beyond their age, gender, and the location where their bodies were found. As news of the second murder spread throughout Phoenix, the city's fear transformed into something darker terror. Parents kept their children indoors. Women traveled in groups. The canal became a place of dread rather than recreation. Melanie's mother collapsed during the press conference announcing her daughter's death, her anguished sobs captured by television cameras and broadcast into homes throughout the city. The image would become symbolic of every parent's worst nightmare, the sudden, senseless loss of a child to violence beyond comprehension. The task force headquarters occupied an entire floor of the Phoenix Police Department, its walls covered with maps, photographs, and timeline charts that told the story of 2 young lives cut short. Detective Ramirez spent 18-hour days staring at the evidence board, searching for patterns, connections, anything that might lead to the killer. Tips poured in from across the city. Every suspicious person became a potential suspect. Transients who frequented the canal area were questioned and released. Men with criminal records were investigated and cleared. The composite sketch drawn from witness descriptions of a man seen near the canal yielded dozens of false leads but no arrests. The FBI profile described the killer as a white male, probably between 25 and 40 years old, familiar with the area around the canal. He likely appeared normal to his neighbors and coworkers, someone who could blend into a crowd without attracting attention. The profile suggested he might work a job that gave him flexible hours or allowed him to be near the canal during different times of day. Months stretched into years. The evidence board grew more cluttered but no clearer. New detectives were assigned to the case as older ones retired or transferred. The families attended every meeting, every briefing, their faces showing the toll of endless waiting and repeated disappointment. Detective Ramirez never stopped believing they would catch the killer. He kept Angela and Melanie's photographs on his desk, a daily reminder of why the work mattered. But as the 1,990 seconds faded into the 2000s, the active investigation necessarily shifted focus to newer cases, newer crimes, newer victims who needed justice. The task force was quietly dissolved in 1998, though the case files remained open. The evidence board was packed away into boxes, stored in a climate-controlled evidence room where it would wait for technology to catch up with the killer's cunning. But the families never stopped waiting, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that someday, somehow, their daughters would receive the justice they deserved. By the year 2000, the cardboard box containing Angela and Melanie's case files had been moved to long-term storage, joining hundreds of other unsolved cases in the basement of the Phoenix Police Department. The box was thick, with reports, witness statements, crime scene photographs, and forensic evidence that had yielded no answers despite years of investigation. Detective Ramirez, now approaching retirement, still visited the storage room occasionally, pulling the box from its shelf and reviewing the contents that had haunted him for nearly a decade. The DNA evidence collected from both crime scenes was minimal and degraded, unusable with the technology available at the time. Fingerprints had been found but matched no one in the database. The killer had been careful, methodical, and lucky. New detectives were occasionally assigned to review cold cases, including the canal murders. They would spend weeks or months re-interviewing witnesses, following up on old tips, applying fresh eyes to evidence that had been examined hundreds of times before. But the results were always the same: more questions than answers, more frustration than progress. Angela's mother called the police department monthly, asking for updates that rarely came. Melanie's mother had moved out of state, unable to bear living in the city where her daughter had died, but she too maintained contact with investigators, hoping for the call that would bring closure to her nightmare. The box represented more than just evidence. It contained the hopes and fears of 2 families, the professional frustration of dozens of detectives, and the promise of a community that justice would eventually be served. Technology would advance, new techniques would be developed, and someday the contents of this box would yield the answers that had remained hidden for so long. But as the millennium turned and the world changed around them, the box sat silent and patient in its storage room, waiting for the day when science would finally catch up with the killer's careful planning. The 12th of November, Angela's mother lit a candle in her daughter's memory. The simple glass votive sat on the mantel beside Angela's high school graduation photograph, a flickering reminder of the birthdays that would never be celebrated, the life that had been stolen by a killer who remained free. The tradition had begun the year after Angela's murder, when her mother found herself unable to let the date pass unmarked. 23 years old, Angela should have been, then 24, 25, 30. With each passing year, the gap between the girl in the photograph and the woman she should have become grew wider, more painful, more impossible to bridge. Melanie's mother had moved to Oregon, seeking distance from the memories that haunted every familiar street in Phoenix. But she too marked the thing. Anniversaries, lighting her own candles, saying her own prayers, keeping her daughter's memory alive through ritual and remembrance. The mothers had bonded in their grief, supporting each other through the long years of waiting for answers that seemed never to come. Support groups for families of murder victims provided some comfort, but nothing could fill the absence left by their daughters' deaths. They learned to carry their grief differently over time, but the weight never lessened. If anything, the passage of years without resolution made their burden heavier, their hope more fragile. Angela's mother refused to remove her daughter's photographs from the walls or pack away her belongings. The bedroom remained exactly as Angela had left it that final evening. Her textbooks still stacked on the desk, her clothes still hanging in the closet. It was a shrine to possibilities that would never be realized. But the memorial candle represented something more than grief. It represented defiance. As long as the mothers kept lighting candles, kept speaking their daughters' names, kept demanding justice, the killer had not achieved complete victory. Love endured beyond death, and memory could be more powerful than silence. Detective Sarah Chen opened the cold case file in 2014 with fresh eyes and new technology. The DNA evidence that had been useless to investigators in the 1,990 seconds could now tell stories that had remained hidden for decades. Advanced forensic genealogy techniques allowed scientists to build family trees from degraded biological samples, turning fragments of genetic material into roadmaps leading to suspects. The DNA extracted from both crime scenes was limited but sufficient for the new testing procedures. Chen watched as laboratory technicians processed samples that had sat in evidence storage for over 20 years, their potential finally ready to be unlocked by science that hadn't existed when the murders were committed. The genealogy work was painstaking and methodical. Scientists compared the unknown DNA profile to thousands of samples in databases, looking for partial matches that might indicate family relationships. They built theoretical family trees, working backward and forward through generations, narrowing possibilities with each new comparison. The breakthrough came in the form of a surname, Miller. The DNA evidence suggested the killer was related to several people named Miller who had submitted their genetic information to ancestry websites. The family tree pointed to a limited number of possibilities in the Phoenix area, men who would have been the right age to commit the murders in the 1,990 seconds. Detective Chen felt the familiar surge of excitement that came with a promising lead, tempered by the caution learned from years of dead ends and false hopes. But this felt different, solid, scientific rather than speculative. As she stared at the DNA sample vial that had waited so patiently in evidence storage, Chen realized she might be holding the key to solving one of Phoenix's most notorious cold cases. The killer had been careful, but not careful enough. Science had finally caught up with him. After more than 20 years, Angela and Melanie might finally get the justice their families had never stopped demanding. The photograph showed a tall, thin man dressed in elaborate zombie makeup and costume, posing with other convention attendees at a Phoenix horror fan gathering. Brian Patrick Miller, known in the community as the Zombie Hunter, had been attending these events for years, driving around the city in a modified police cruiser and creating an eccentric but seemingly harmless persona. Detective Chen studied the photograph as part of her background research into the Miller family members who had emerged as potential suspects. Brian lived alone with his teenage daughter, worked odd jobs, and had no significant criminal history beyond some minor infractions. On paper, he appeared to be just another Phoenix resident, unremarkable except for his unusual hobby. But as Chen dug deeper into Miller's background, troubling details began to emerge. As a teenager, he had been involved in a violent altercation that resulted in serious injury to another youth. The incident had been covered up or dismissed, but it suggested a capacity for violence that contradicted his public image as an eccentric but harmless horror fan. Neighbors described Miller as odd but polite, someone who kept to himself but wasn't considered dangerous. His zombie hunter persona was well known in certain circles, but most people saw it as nothing more than an elaborate costume hobby. He attended conventions, participated in community events, and generally seemed to enjoy the attention his outlandish appearance attracted. The photograph captured something unsettling in Miller's eyes, a coldness that seemed inconsistent with the playful nature of the costume event. Chen had learned to trust her instincts about potential suspects, and something about this particular Miller family member felt wrong. She decided to recommend him for closer surveillance and investigation. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators were the ones who hid in plain sight, concealing their true nature behind carefully constructed public personas that deflected suspicion and attention. Detective Chen watched from across the restaurant as Brian Patrick Miller sat at his table, unaware that his every move was being observed and recorded. The surveillance operation had been planned carefully. Miller had been lured to the location through a fake online dating profile, believing he was meeting a woman for a casual dinner. Miller appeared nervous but excited, checking his phone frequently and adjusting his clothing. To other diners, he looked like any middle-aged man on a first date, hoping to make a good impression. He ordered water and a sandwich, making small talk with the waitress and seeming to enjoy the possibility of romance. But Detective Chen saw something else in his demeanor, a watchfulness, an alertness that suggested he was always scanning his environment for threats or opportunities. Even while trying to appear relaxed and normal, Miller's eyes constantly moved, cataloging the faces around him, noting the exits, maintaining the heightened awareness of someone accustomed to hiding secrets. When Miller left the restaurant, disappointed that his date had never shown up, the undercover officers moved quickly to secure his table. The water glass he had drunk from was carefully bagged and tagged, then rushed to the forensic laboratory for DNA analysis. The results came back within days, a perfect match to the DNA evidence collected from both Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis. After more than 20 years, the Canal Killer finally had a name and a face. The eccentric zombie hunter who had lived among them, attending community events and entertaining children at parties, was the monster who had terrorized Phoenix in the 1,990 seconds. Detective Chen held the evidence bag containing the glass and felt the weight of 2 decades of grief, frustration, and waiting. This simple drinking glass represented justice delayed but not denied, the moment when science finally caught up with evil. Judge Patterson signed the arrest warrant with a steady hand, though inwardly she felt the gravity of the moment. After 23 years, the families of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis would finally see their daughter's killer face justice. The DNA evidence was overwhelming, the legal case solid, the warrant properly prepared and legally sound. Detective Chen coordinated with SWAT teams as they prepared to serve the warrant at Miller's residence. They had been watching him for weeks since the DNA match was confirmed, ensuring he posed no flight risk while they built their case. Miller continued his normal routine, unaware that his decades of freedom were about to end. The operation was planned for early morning, when Miller would most likely be at home and less alert to potential threats. SWAT officers positioned themselves around his modest Phoenix home while Detective Chen and her partner approached the front door. Neighbors were quietly evacuated from nearby houses as a precautionary measure. Angela's mother had been notified the night before that an arrest was imminent. After 23 years of waiting, she found herself unable to sleep, pacing her living room and staring at her daughter's photograph. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was actually happening, she felt numb rather than relieved. Melanie's mother received a similar call in Oregon, where she had rebuilt her life after leaving Phoenix. She sat on her porch as dawn broke over the mountains, thinking about the 17-year-old daughter she had lost and the justice that was finally within reach. The arrest warrant represented more than just a legal document. It was the culmination of thousands of hours of investigation. The persistence of 2 mothers who had refused to let their daughters be forgotten, and the advancement of forensic science that had finally provided answers to questions that had haunted Phoenix for decades. The insanity plea filed by Miller's defense attorneys painted a picture of a deeply damaged individual whose childhood abuse had fractured his mind and created gaps in his memory. According to the psychological evaluations, Miller claimed to have no recollection of the murders, suffering from dissociative amnesia that blocked traumatic events from his conscious awareness. The defense strategy was carefully crafted to generate sympathy while acknowledging the DNA evidence that made denial impossible. Miller's attorneys argued that severe childhood sexual and physical abuse had created multiple personalities, one of which was responsible for the Canal murders, while Miller's conscious mind remained unaware of its actions. Angela's mother sat in the courtroom gallery as the plea was read aloud, her face showing no emotion but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. After 23 years of waiting for justice, she was being asked to feel compassion for the man who had tortured and murdered her daughter. The request felt obscene, impossible, a betrayal of everything she had endured. Melanie's mother had flown back to Phoenix for the proceedings, taking a leave of absence from her job in Oregon. She listened to the defense claims with growing anger, remembering her 17-year-old daughter's dreams and plans, the future that had been stolen not by mental illness but by deliberate evil. The prosecution prepared to challenge every aspect of the insanity defense, bringing in their own psychological experts to evaluate Miller's claims. The legal battle would be long and complex, requiring the families to relive their trauma repeatedly as lawyers argued over the killer's mental state. But regardless of the defense strategy, both families felt a measure of relief that Miller had finally been arrested and would face trial. The insanity plea was simply another obstacle to overcome, another delay in the pursuit of justice that had already taken far too long. The court calendar told the story of a justice system struggling with a complex case involving mental health evaluations, competency hearings, and endless legal motions. What should have been a straightforward prosecution became a marathon of delays and procedural challenges that stretched from 2015 to 2023. Miller was declared incompetent to stand trial multiple times, requiring extended stays at state psychiatric facilities for evaluation and treatment. Each competency hearing resulted in more delays, more frustration for the families who had already waited decades for resolution. The defense filed motion after motion, challenging evidence, requesting evaluations, seeking delays for various procedural reasons. Angela's mother aged visibly during the years of court proceedings. The stress of attending hearing after hearing, only to see the case postponed again and again, took a toll on her health and emotional well-being. She had imagined that Miller's arrest would bring closure, but instead it had opened a new chapter of uncertainty and frustration. The COVID-19 pandemic added additional delays to an already slow-moving case. Courts shut down, hearings were postponed, and the families found themselves trapped in a legal limbo that seemed to have no end. Virtual hearings replaced in-person proceedings, adding technical difficulties to an already complex situation. Detective Chen, now promoted to sergeant, maintained regular contact with the families throughout the prolonged legal process. She understood their frustration and shared their desire to see the case resolved, but she also knew that thorough preparation was essential to ensure Miller's conviction would withstand any appeals. The court calendar became a testament to the persistence required by everyone involved in the case: the families who attended every hearing, the prosecutors who rebuilt their case multiple times, the investigators who continued gathering evidence even after the arrest. Justice was coming, but it would arrive on its own timeline rather than theirs. The evidence folder had grown thick over the 8 years between Miller's arrest and his trial. DNA reports, updated forensic analyses, witness statements, and hundreds of crime scene photographs created a comprehensive record of 2 brutal murders and their aftermath. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh had spent months organizing the evidence into a narrative that would convince Judge Suzanne Cohen of Miller's guilt. The decision to proceed with a bench trial rather than a jury trial had been made after extensive consultation with the families. Given Miller's insanity, defense, and the complex psychological testimony involved, both sides agreed that a judge would be better equipped to weigh the technical evidence and reach a fair verdict. Judge Cohen had a reputation for thoroughness and fairness, qualities that both prosecution and defense respected. She had presided over numerous high-profile cases during her career and was known for her careful consideration of evidence and her ability to separate emotion from legal fact. The evidence folder contained crime scene photographs that were difficult to view even for experienced law enforcement professionals. The brutality inflicted on both victims spoke to a level of violence that went beyond simple murder. These were crimes of rage, possibly sexual in nature, committed by someone who took pleasure in causing suffering. Angela's mother had requested to see some of the evidence before the trial began, wanting to understand exactly what had happened to her daughter. Detective Chen had gently discouraged this, knowing that the images would haunt her for the rest of her life. Some knowledge was too terrible to bear, even for a mother seeking understanding of her child's final moments. The folder represented thousands of hours of investigative work, scientific analysis, and legal preparation. It contained the story of 2 young women's final hours and the evidence that would finally hold their killer accountable for his actions. Angela's mother approached the witness stand with dignity despite the tremor in her hands. After 31 years of carrying her grief, she finally had the opportunity to speak directly to her daughter's killer and tell the world what Angela's life had meant. The courtroom fell completely silent as she began to speak. Angela was preparing for her 22nd birthday when she died, she said, her voice steady but thick with emotion. She had plans. She was going to graduate school, maybe become a teacher. She wanted children someday, a family of her own. She called me every day, worried about me more than herself. She paused, looking directly at Miller, who sat motionless at the defense table. You didn't just kill my daughter. You killed her future, my future as a grandmother, her father's pride in walking her down the aisle. You killed 31 years of birthdays, holidays, phone calls, hugs. You killed everything she could have been. The testimony continued for nearly an hour. Angela's mother describing not just her daughter's death, but her life, the dreams that would never be fulfilled, the love that had been cut short, the hole in their family that could never be filled. She spoke about the years of wondering, the sleepless nights, the way grief had shaped every day since November 1992. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even court officers who had heard hundreds of victim impact statements were visibly moved by her words. Miller remained expressionless, showing no reaction to the mother's devastating testimony. The transcript would become part of the permanent record, ensuring that Angela's memory and her mother's pain would be preserved long after the trial ended. It was more than just legal testimony. It was a mother's love letter to a daughter who would never grow old. The DNA evidence chart dominated the courtroom wall, its colorful genetic markers and statistical probabilities telling a story that was both scientific and devastating. Dr. Martinez, the forensic geneticist, used a laser pointer to guide the judge through the complex data that had finally identified Angela and Melanie's killer after 3 decades. The probability that this DNA belongs to someone other than the defendant is 1 in 6.2 billion, Dr. Martinez explained, his voice clinical and precise. This means that Brian Patrick Miller is the source of the genetic material found at both crime scenes with virtual certainty. Judge Cohen studied the chart intently, asking detailed questions about the collection procedures, the chain of custody, and the reliability of the testing methods. The scientific evidence was overwhelming, but she wanted to ensure that every aspect of the genetic analysis could withstand scrutiny on appeal. The defense attorneys challenged various aspects of the DNA evidence, questioning the degradation of the samples over time and the possibility of contamination. but their objections seemed weak compared to the strength of the scientific proof displayed on the courtroom wall. Angela's mother watched the proceedings with fascination and horror. The same DNA that had created her daughter was now being used to convict her killer. There was something both beautiful and terrible about the way science had preserved Angela's final moments, capturing genetic evidence that would speak for her when she could no longer speak for herself. Melanie's mother had flown back from Oregon specifically to hear the DNA testimony. She wanted to understand exactly how the scientists had connected Miller to her daughter's murder, how technology had finally accomplished what decades of traditional investigation could not. The chart represented the triumph of modern forensic science over criminal cunning. Miller had been careful, but not careful enough to defeat the genetic evidence that would ultimately seal his fate. Prosecutor Walsh's closing argument notes were covered with underlines, arrows, and emotional emphasis marks that revealed the passion behind her methodical legal approach. She had prosecuted hundreds of cases during her career, but few had carried the weight of 30 years of waiting families and community trauma. Your Honor, she began, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. This case is about more than just DNA evidence and crime scene analysis. It's about justice delayed but not denied. It's about two young women who had their entire futures stolen by a predator who thought he could hide behind time and silence. She walked the judge through the timeline of evidence. From the initial brutal murders, through the decades of investigation to the breakthrough that had finally identified Miller, each piece of evidence built upon the others, creating an overwhelming case for conviction that no reasonable doubt could undermine. The defense had argued that Miller's childhood trauma created a mental state that absolved him of responsibility for his actions. Walsh rejected this argument forcefully, pointing out that thousands of abuse survivors never hurt anyone, that trauma might explain behavior but could never excuse it. Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness were innocent victims who deserved to live full lives. Walsh continued, her voice rising with emotion. They deserve to grow up, get married, have children, contribute to their community. Instead, they were brutally murdered by a man who chose violence over self-control, who chose his own pleasure over their right to exist. She concluded by asking Judge Cohen to speak for Angela and Melanie, to give them the justice they had been denied for 31 years. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as she returned to her seat, her closing argument complete. The notes would be preserved in the case file, a record of the moment when 3 decades of investigation culminated in a final plea for justice. Judge Suzanne Cohen had spent weeks reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the legal arguments before reaching her decision. The guilty verdict document she signed on the 14th of April 2023 was the culmination of the most complex case of her judicial career and one of the most significant moments in Phoenix legal history. The court finds the defendant, Brian Patrick Miller, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Angela Brasso. Judge Cohen read aloud, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. The court finds the defendant guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Melanie Burness. The court finds the defendant guilty of kidnapping and sexual assault in both cases. Angela's mother closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. After 31 years of waiting, her daughter finally had justice. Beside her, Melanie's mother wept openly, her shoulders shaking with decades of suppressed grief and relief. Miller showed no visible reaction to the verdict, sitting motionless at the defense table as if the words had no meaning for him. His defense attorneys immediately began preparing for the sentencing phase, knowing that their client would likely face the death penalty. Detective Chen, now retired but present for the verdict, felt a profound sense of completion. The case that had haunted her department for decades was finally resolved. The families could begin the process of true healing, knowing that their daughter's killer would never hurt anyone else. The verdict document became part of Arizona legal history, marking the end of one of the state's longest-running cold cases. But more importantly, it represented validation for 2 mothers who had never stopped believing that their daughters deserved justice, no matter how long it took. The guilty verdict was not just a legal conclusion, it was a moral statement that some crimes can never be forgotten, some victims can never be abandoned, and some families deserve answers no matter how much time passes. On the 7th of June 2023, Judge Cohen delivered the sentence that 2 families had waited 31 years to hear. The death penalty, reserved for the most heinous crimes, seemed inadequate for the suffering Miller had caused, but it was the harshest punishment available under Arizona law. Mr. Miller, Judge Cohen said, looking directly at the defendant, you have been found guilty of crimes so brutal and senseless that they shock the conscience of this community. You have shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain you have caused, no recognition of the lives you have destroyed. The sentencing hearing had included additional victim impact statements from family members, friends, and community members whose lives had been forever changed by Miller's actions. Each speaker added another layer to the portrait of devastation he had created, another voice demanding accountability for his crimes. Miller would be sent to death row at the Arizona State Prison Complex, where he would likely spend years appealing his conviction while the families continued to wait for final closure. The appeals process could stretch on for decades, but at least he would never be free to hurt anyone else. Angela's mother felt a complex mixture of emotions as the sentence was pronounced. Justice had been served, but it could never restore what had been taken from her. Her daughter was still gone, the years of grief and uncertainty still part of her life story, the trauma still woven into her daily existence. Melanie's mother stood and quietly left the courtroom immediately after the sentencing, unable to bear another moment in the presence of her daughter's killer. Outside, she told reporters that the death sentence felt appropriate but could never truly balance the scales of justice. The death sentence order marked the legal end of the Canal murders case, but the emotional aftermath would continue for the rest of the family's lives. Standing on the courthouse steps with reporters' microphones thrust toward her face, Angela's mother delivered the statement she had been preparing for 31 years. Her words were measured, dignified, and heavy with the weight of 3 decades of grief and determination. Today, justice was served for Angela and Melanie, she began, her voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. But I want people to understand that this verdict doesn't bring our daughters back. It doesn't give us back the 31 years we've spent wondering, waiting, hoping for answers. She paused, looking out at the crowd of reporters, community members, and supporters who had gathered to witness this historic moment. What this verdict does give us is the knowledge that Angela and Melanie were not forgotten. It tells us that their lives mattered, that their deaths mattered. Then, justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. The press statement continued with, thanks to the investigators who had never given up on the case, the prosecutors who had built such a strong legal argument, and Judge Cohen who had listened carefully to all the evidence. She also acknowledged the community members who had supported the families through decades of uncertainty. I want other families of murder victims to know that you should never give up hope, she concluded. Keep your children's names alive. Keep demanding answers. Keep believing that someday, somehow, the truth will come out. Angela and Melanie waited 31 years for justice, but they got it. Your children will too. The statement was broadcast across Phoenix and picked up by national news outlets, becoming a powerful testament to a mother's love and determination. It served as both closure for one case and inspiration for other families still waiting for their own justice. In the days following Miller's sentencing, flowers began appearing along the canal path where Angela and Melanie had been found decades earlier. Roses, lilies, carnations, and wildflowers created a spontaneous memorial that grew larger each day as community members came to pay their respects. The canal had been avoided by many Phoenix residents for 30 years, its dark waters carrying the memory of violence and fear. But now, with the killer finally convicted and sentenced, people began to reclaim the space, transforming it from a place of dread into a site of remembrance and healing. Children who had never known Angela and Melanie left handwritten notes with the flowers, promising to remember their names and their stories. Parents brought their teenage daughters to the memorial, using it as an opportunity to discuss safety, awareness, and the importance of community vigilance. Angela's mother visited the memorial daily in the weeks after the trial, sometimes alone and sometimes with Melanie's mother who had extended her stay in Phoenix. They would stand quietly by the water, watching the flowers drift in the gentle current, finally able to visit the place where their daughters had died without feeling overwhelmed by rage and helplessness. The memorial flowers represented more than just sympathy. They symbolized the community's recognition that it had failed to protect 2 young women but had ultimately succeeded in seeking justice for their deaths. The bright colors against the dark water created a visual reminder that beauty could emerge from tragedy, that memory could be more powerful than fear. Local news stations covered the growing memorial, showing time-lapse footage of community members adding to the display throughout the day. The images became a powerful symbol of healing and closure that resonated far beyond Phoenix. In the final moments of their long journey toward justice, both mothers held the same framed photographs they had carried to every court hearing, every anniversary vigil, every community meeting for 31 years. Angela's picture showed her at 21, radiant and full of life, her smile capturing the optimism of a young woman who believed her future was limitless. Melanie's photograph had been taken just months before her death, showing a 17-year-old girl with bright eyes and an infectious grin. She wore her high school cheerleading uniform, her hair perfectly styled for the team photo that had become the image by which Phoenix would remember her. These photographs had become more than just memories. They were talismans of hope, symbols of persistence, reminders of why the fight for justice had been worth every tear, every sleepless night, every disappointing court hearing. The mothers had carried them through decades of grief, using them to keep their daughters' faces in the public eye when investigators moved on to other cases. Now, as the legal proceedings finally concluded, the photographs took on new meaning. They were no longer just appeals for justice, they were monuments to love that had transcended death, to determination that had outlasted despair, to the power of memory to sustain hope through the darkest times. The images would continue to sit on mantles and bedside tables, but they would no longer carry the weight of unanswered questions. Instead, they would represent closure, peace, and the knowledge that Angela and Melanie's stories had finally been told in full. 22 and 17 years old forever, frozen in time but not forgotten. Their smiling faces had watched over 31 years of waiting and witnessed the moment when justice finally came home. The canal path in Phoenix flows quietly now, no longer carrying the shadow of unsolved murder. Children ride bicycles along its banks while their parents watch from nearby benches. The fear that once gripped this community finally released by the knowledge that Brian Patrick Miller will never hurt anyone again. Angela's mother still lights a candle every the 12th of November, but now it burns in celebration of her daughter's memory rather than in desperate hope for answers. The ritual has transformed from a plea for justice into a prayer of gratitude for the investigators who never gave up, for the science that finally revealed the truth, for the community that never forgot two young women whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. Melanie's mother has returned to Oregon, but she comes back to Phoenix each year on the anniversary of her daughter's death. The city holds different memories now, not just of loss and terror, but of persistence and eventual triumph. The Canal Memorial has become a place of peace rather than pain. Detective Chen, now retired, occasionally drives past the canal on her evening walks. She thinks about the case that defined her career, the families who taught her about the power of love to endure unthinkable loss, and the moment when decades of investigation finally yielded the answers everyone had been seeking. The story of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis will be remembered not just as a tale of murder and delayed justice, but as proof that some bonds can never be broken, some love can never be defeated, and some truths can never be buried forever. Their mothers carried them through 31 years of darkness and into the light of resolution. Evil may hide for decades, but it cannot hide forever. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. And love, the love of mothers for their daughters, can sustain hope through any trial, any waiting, any grief. Their names live on. Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis, 22 and 17 years old, forever young, forever remembered, finally at peace.